Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at a political topic, as that's my main area of study. And the idea I'm looking at today is how the Western Europeans think, or how the Western intellectuals think, and what frames their ideas and intentions of how they engage with the world on the international scale in terms of international relations. So basically what I'm looking at is their global agenda of the America and Western Europe in particular. I'll be touching on also some ideas around Russia and Asia, mainly China. But it's mainly looking at how the West thinks and looks at the ways in which it wants to interact, in fact, how it actually interacts with the world. So it's basically Western political thinking and a couple of theories, some of their main theories in regards to international relations. And looking at the reasons why they want to venture into other lands and what they intend to gain and how they perceive other nations in terms of their intentions in the world, or if they have any intentions in the broader world, or whether they focus mainly on their own societies, as opposed to, it seems to, those in the West think. Their intentions seem to be focused on their own and also what they can gain from the broader world, or how they can manipulate the broader world. So I'll be focusing mainly on two books. The first is called The Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski. He served as a counselor to a former president, Lyndon Johnson, between 1966 and 1968. And he was also Jimmy Carter's national security advisor between 1977 and 1981. So they're saying that he has influenced generations of policymakers in the US with the type of ideas that he provided them and his ideas of how the world should be run, or how America should interact with the world. And then the other book is by John Mearsheimer. It's called A Tragedy of Great Power Politics. He's also a prominent American political scientist and international relations scholar. So he's a non-resident at the Quincy Institute. It's a think tank in the US. So those are the two Western authors I'll be looking at and taking a look at their ideas around international politics and international relations. So there are 5 sections to what I'm going to be discussing. Those are the theories, ideas around theories, this concept of power, political power, then the US leadership, the European control, how America basically interacts with Europe, and also how it interacts with Asia. That's the last part. So in terms of theories, there are 2 main theories that they use in political science, international relations. These are the liberalism and realism. So I'll be looking at the liberal theory first of all. And basically, I'll be taking sections or paragraphs from each of their books and see what they have to say about that particular topic. Liberalism and realism as theories, they mainly come from Mr. Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Powers. So, let me take a look at the first one. So it's basically saying here, first, liberals consider states to be the main actors in the international politics. Second, they emphasize that internal characteristics of states vary considerably and that these differences have profound effects on state behavior. So in terms of what these so-called liberals think is, they think the players within a country, or the main players, that is the wealthy, and the economically strong, they have the most say within a country. So they may probably be the same people who define how the country behaves on the international stage. And liberal theorists often believe that some internal arrangements i.e. democracy, are inherently preferable to dictatorship. So they're saying basically that a country that is a democracy is more favorable to them than what they call a dictatorship or a monarchy. They might even look at a monarchy as a form of dictatorship since there's only one leader. So for them, a good state is a democracy and a bad state is what so-called dictatorship. And good states pursue cooperative policies, which means they cooperate with other states on the international stage, whereas bad states cause conflict, cause wars as they're going forward with their own agendas. So in that sense, it's not necessary that a dictatorship is seeking to expand on the international stage, because even democracies, as we all know in terms of the US and many European countries, seem to want to make war in particular regions of the world to cause instability in the pursuit of obtaining their own objectives and keeping certain regions of the world in a stage where they can't economically develop to challenge the West. And third, the liberals believe that calculations about power matter for explaining the behavior of good states. Power I'll be touching on in a while, but I'm looking at the two theories at the moment. So among the various theories found under the big tent of liberalism, you have this first argues that high levels of economic interdependence among states make them unlikely to fight each other. And the taproot of stability, according to this theory, is the creation and maintenance of a liberal economic order that allows for free economic exchange among states, such as an order makes states more prosperous. Such an order makes states more prosperous, thereby bolstering peace, because prosperous states are more economically satisfied and satisfied states are more peaceful. Well, America is an economically strong state. As we know, and certain Western countries are economically strong, but somehow they're not satisfied with what's happening in the world. They find they have to interfere in other regions of the world. And that's one of the main reasons we know for that is they want to maintain dominance. Any other state that's coming along that appears to be getting economically strong and is a possible challenger, that is what they don't want to happen. Another is the second, I should say, the democratic peace theory claims that democracies do not go to war against other democracies. So a world containing only democracies would be a world without war, theoretically. The argument here is not that democracies are less warlike, but rather than that democracies do not fight amongst themselves. We know that's not true already. Many countries in Europe have gone to war with each other. So that's not much of it. Well, as we know, a democracy, in terms of the way the US sees countries in the developing world or the less wealthy world, if those democracies have a leader that is favorable to the US, then that is okay. But if it's a democracy and the leader that the people have voted for is not somebody who is in support of the US, then somehow they'll instigate a coup or cause disruptions in that country, or sending the CIA or National Endowment for Democracy or such organizations to destabilize that country until they find a leader or create a leader for that country that they want to be the person leading that state. Anyway, liberals maintain that international institutions enhance the prospects for cooperation among states and thus significantly reduce the likelihood of war. Institutions are not independent political entities that sit above states. Basically saying that international institutions like the UN and World Trade Organization and so forth, they're supposedly created by states, or their regulations are negotiated by states for rules that they will abide by themselves. But we know in terms of the Bretton Woods organizations and the UN, things are not as clear-cut as that. And the other theory is the realism, as I mentioned. Realists focus mainly on great powers. However, I'll mention great powers later on. However, because these states dominate and shape international politics, they also cause the deadliest wars. Second, realists believe that the behavior of great powers is influenced mainly by their external environment, not by their internal characteristics. So basically, this realist idea is that a state looks at how its neighbors are behaving or other states around the world are behaving, and they try and determine as to whether that state is going to be a threat to them or not, and that decides their interactions with the rest of the world. And the last part is the structure of the international system, which all states must deal with, largely shapes their foreign policy. Realists tend not to draw sharp distinctions between good and bad states, because all great powers act according to the same logic regardless of their culture, political system, or who runs the government. So whoever's in power, basically, even though it's supposed to be a democratic society with different so-called views, they behave the same on the international stage, according to a realist idea. But we know that's not quite true. And the third part, realists hold that calculations about power dominate states. So power is a major issue in terms of how states view other countries. In the Western understanding of things, and states compete for power among themselves, that competition sometimes necessitates war, which is considered an acceptable instrument of statecraft. Well, war has taken place, whether it's in the Western world or wherever in the world. So, and a zero-sum quality characterizes the competition, sometimes making it zero-sum. When I say use the term zero-sum, it means one party wins and one party loses. So it's either you win or you lose. The lose is the zero, basically. As opposed to a positive sum. Positive sum is when both parties gain something out of the situation. Anyway, that's a look at the realist. And this is the last one in terms of how realists looking at, in terms of a peaceful world. Realists agree that creating a peaceful world would be desirable, but they see no easy way to escape the harsh world of security, competition, and war. They see it basically almost like a dog-eat-dog world, where states are always looking over their shoulder at their neighbors and other states around the world that at any moment you can go to war with them or be in some kind of contention. That's the Western way of looking at the world, as opposed to, I'm not saying there hasn't been war in Africa or Asia, but particularly in Africa, the concept is not necessarily about war, it's about how to get along. There are other ways to solve problems rather than going directly to war. And these concept of players and pivot, geostrategic players, or the major players in the world, this is from the Grand Chessboard, this is Brzezinski's favored book. So, is explaining what a geostrategic player is. Active geostrategic players are the states that have the capacity and the national will to exercise power or influence beyond their borders in order to alter, to a degree, that affects America's interests, the existing political state of affairs. They have the potential and or the deep predisposition to be geopolitically volatile for whatever reason. The quest for national grandeur, ideological fulfillment, religious messianism, or economic aggrandizement. It's usually some kind of dominance factor that these so-called great powers or geostrategic players, I'm talking about mainly the US and the Western powers, that they want to interfere or exercise their power across the world. Is either to protect resources, maintain control of a region, prevent a region from developing and becoming independent, or something like that. In the ancient times, you'd probably say there'll be religious wars, but in terms of the current world, well, then again, you could argue that the West wants to maintain its Judeo-Christian dominance of the world in terms of the cultural mindsets of people around the world. Anyway, that was players, a pivot. The states whose importance is derived not from their power and motivation, but rather their sensitive location and from the consequences of their potentially vulnerable condition for the behavior of a geostrategic player. So geopolitical pivots are determined by their geography, where the location is in proximity to the major players, and how, if something happens to that pivot state, how it will affect the major players. I'll give some examples of players and pivots in a minute. In some cases, geopolitical pivot may act as a defensive shield for a vital state or even a region. Sometimes the very existence of a geopolitical pivot can be said to have very significant political and cultural consequences for a more active neighboring geostrategic player. And here are some examples of the players, what he qualifies as players. Those in Eurasia include France, Germany, Russia, China, and India. They are major players in their regions. Even though they mention Great Britain here, Great Britain, Japan, and Indonesia, while they're important countries, they're not actually players. They're not the... Earlier in his book, and John Maishirma's book, they mention France and Germany being the main players in Europe. Great Britain is seen has always been seen as a country that has never really wanted to be part of the European Union. So France and Germany, we know France in terms of what happened to Libya. They were one of the main players in wanting to get rid of Gaddafi because of the currency issue. Germany, I've recently been reading, their economy has crashed extensively, not just because of the Ukraine war and their lack of availability of cheap natural gas from Russia, but their economy has been in decline for a while because of their own policies. So even though these are main players as perceived, but then again, this was written some in 1991, I think it was, so some 30 odd years ago. So economics would have changed since then. Anyway, let's move on to the pivots. These are the pivots. Countries like Ukraine, Azerbaijan, South Korea, Turkey, and Iran play the role of critically important geopolitical pivots. They mention Turkey and Iran. They are to some extent, but they're more like players in their regions, if you ask me. Turkey and Iran. But anyway, let me continue. And that is it on theories and these ideas of players and pivots. There's two theories and the two of Brzezinski's ideas on players in the international system. What I'm going to look at now is the idea is power, the role of power. Power is the ability to control and influence what other states will do or intend to do. So you can do that through bribery, coercion, through persuasion, or through war. So I'll be looking at, this is from John Maishirma's book. He deals a lot more with theories than the other author. So he's saying here that states have two kinds of power, latent power and military power. Latent power refers to the socio-economic ingredients that go into building military power. It is largely based on the state's wealth and overall size of its population. Great powers need money, technology, and personal wealth to build military forces and to fight wars. So latent power is basically the economic strength and the social capital, you might argue, of a state. But in international politics, the power that's mainly dominant in the international world is military force. the United States and the Soviet Union were the most powerful states, that's what he's saying here, in the world during the Cold War, because their military establishments dwarfed those of other states. So they're seen as the two strongest countries, basically, because of their military. Although the US's economy was much stronger than Russia. And this thing called the balance of power is largely synonymous with the balance of military power. And so power is defined a lot in military terms. There's economic power as well, but military is seen on the international stage as the main reason why you would look at a country as powerful. Military power is based largely on the size and strength of a state's army and its supporting air and naval forces, even in nuclear terms. Armies are the core ingredient, that is, land armies are the main ingredient, according to this anyway, in terms of the military. Although independent naval forces and strategic air forces play a role, but land forces is seen as the main form of military. But then again, things are changing with the coming in of new technology in terms of not only drones are new, what about robot armies and those things that are coming in? Anyway, let me continue from here. Latent power. States care greatly about latent power because abundant wealth and a large population are prerequisite for building formidable military forces. Again, they're saying during the Cold War, the American leaders worried about Soviet economic growth, mainly because of their economic growth would also build a strong army. And they move on to say that China, in more recent times, the US is also becoming increasingly worried about China as it's building a strong economy and it has a population at the time of 1.2 billion. And it's saying that should China become especially wealthy, it could readily become a military superpower and challenge the United States. So anyway, what qualifies for, I mentioned slightly what qualifies for a great power. A great power, a state must have sufficient military assets to put up a serious fight in an all-out conventional war against the most powerful state in the world. The candidate need not have the capability to defeat the leading state, but it must have some reasonable prospect of turning the conflict into a war of attrition that leaves the dominant state seriously weakened, even if that dominant state ultimately wins the war. So even if the two largest military forces fight and there's one that is more dominant, as long as the weaker one can cause a certain amount of damage to, for example, Russia causing a certain amount of damage to the US, because Russia has a much smaller population and a much smaller military budget. It's only really its nuclear arsenal that counts it as a superpower in terms of in military terms. I think that's the last part on great powers and power itself. So the next, we've discussed the theories, what power is and why they want to use power and how states use power. And now we're going to focus mainly on the US itself and what it thinks of even its neighbor Europe. So the political thinking in the US is that in order to feel safe, it needs to ensure that countries around the world identify with and emulate its political systems and its culture, which is something which most people know, I think. The US has a tendency to want to force its way of life on other nations, democracy being the main example of that. So here, Brzezinski is saying about the United States that for some time to come, more than a generation, America's status as the world premier is unlikely to be contested by any single challenger. This is back in 1991. No nation state is likely to match America in the four key dimensions of power: military, economic, technological, and cultural, that cumulatively produce decisive global political clout Short of a deliberate or unintentional American abdication, the only real alternative to American global leadership in the foreseeable future is international anarchy. So, in his view, if America is no longer dominant in the world will fall into anarchy. But we have been moving into a more multipolar world in more recent years, where America's influence is declining, but nobody's talking about anarchy. This is a Western mindset, saying that if they're not in charge, then things will collapse, and all countries will be fighting amongst each other. So they see a necessity for them to dominate, not only for them to have control of things, but because they see a world without them being in charge as a world in which things will collapse and fall apart. But that isn't what's taking place today. For example, the BRICS is forming an alternative, although it's still small and growing, it's forming an alternative structure in which you don't have one major dominant power or a couple of major dominant powers. You have many players around the world in their different regions, and their decisions are made by consensus, not by Western bullying. In addition, this is continuing. One must consider, as part of the American system, the global web of specialized organizations, especially the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are two examples he gives here. And he goes on, in reality, however, they are heavily American-dominated, and their origins are traced to American initiative, particularly the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. So he's acknowledging that these so-called global institutions are basically Western-formed institutions for American benefit. And American supremacy has thus produced a new international order that not only replicates but institutionalizes abroad many of the features of the American system itself. And these features include collective security, including integrated command and forces, that's NATO, the US-Japan Security Treaty, and so forth. Then you have APAC, NAFTA, this North American Free Trade Agreement, and the World Bank, IMF, and World Trade. These are all US-based organizations which they perceive as institutions set up. Although global, they have to be the ones who are the main sayers, main players, who have the last say or the greatest say in these institutions. Anyway, even though, yes, they're democratic, but for example, the IMF, although they're trying to balance things out in the IMF in terms of voting power, the Western countries still, or America in particular, still has the greatest voting contingent. And talking about the Soviet Union, this is from John Meishimer's book. Even though the Soviet Union has disappeared, the United States still maintains around 100,000 troops in Europe and roughly the same number in Northeast Asia. It does so because it recognizes that the dangerous rivalries would probably emerge among the major powers in these regions if the US troops were withdrawn. So they're saying if the US troops are not in these regions, then these other so-called powers would fight amongst themselves. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is to maintain US dominance in the region. It's a psychological game that they're playing. Moreover, almost every European state, including the United Kingdom and France, still harbors deep-seated, albeit muted fears that Germany, unchecked by American power, might behave aggressively. Fear of Japan in Northeast Asia is probably even more. So within their thinking, this is just America against its own partners in Europe, thinking that if their troops leave Europe, then the Europeans will start fighting amongst themselves. Also in Asia, Japan, they perceive would be a threat to Asia if US troops were not there. So they're saying a world without US primacy will be a world with more violence and disorder and less democracy and economic growth than a world where the United States continues to have more influence than any other country in shaping global affairs. The sustained international primacy of the United States is essential to the welfare and the security of Americans and to the future of their freedom, democracy, and open economies of the international order. So that is according to one of their primary international security advisors in terms of how they see the US. But now I'm going to look more closely at Europe. That was America, and how America looks at the world and how it wants to control the world, and the reasoning behind why it thinks that, that's what it presents on paper, as to why it sees itself as being necessary in terms of controlling or maintaining some kind of global structure or global footprint in different regions of the world. It sees itself as some kind of arbiter of peace in different regions of the world, a bringer of stability, you might argue. Anyway, this is the Eurasian chessboard. This is Brzezinski again. For America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. For half a millennium, world affairs were dominated by Eurasian powers and peoples who fought with one another for regional domination and reached out for global power. Now a non-Eurasian power is preeminent, that is America. America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on Eurasian continents is sustained. Basically what it's saying, America's primacy is dependent on whether Europe rises up or not. If Europe rises up economically and politically and becomes more independent from America, it will become a competitor on the international stage, which is something America doesn't want. Continuing, it follows that a wider Europe and an enlarged NATO will serve well both the short-term and the longer-term goals of the US policy. A larger Europe will expand the range of American influence, and through the admission of new Central European members, also increase in the European councils on the number of states with a pro-American proclivity. Because of their link to Europe and Europe's semi-subservience to America, if Europe expands into Eastern Europe, those states will also be subservient to America, according to his logic, because they'll follow the democratic governance style, the neoliberal economic policies and so forth of the West, because they see it as ways of becoming wealthy. So, continuing, without simultaneously creating a Europe politically so integrated that it could soon challenge the United States on geopolitical matters of high importance to America elsewhere. So it might, a united and economically and politically strong Europe may challenge America on interactions in other regions of the world. So America's policies or America's interactions with Asia might suffer if Europe becomes strong and starts interacting with Asia in a particular way which undermines what America wants to do. For example, if they start trading more with Asia than America, and this ends up pulling trade away from the US, that's seen as something that would be detrimental to America. And these are the things that will cause even not just economic tensions, but even possibly military tensions. Consider how Clinton and company justified expanding the membership of NATO in the mid-1990s. Clinton maintained that one of the chief goals of expansion was locking in democracies' gains in Central Europe, because democracies resolve their differences peacefully. So it's another false statement. Moving the border of NATO eastward, he maintained, would help to solidify the national consensus for democratic and market reforms, and that already existed in states like Hungary and Poland. So they wanted to create more democracies as they move closer to Russia. I'll be touching on Russia also in a short while. Yeah, in fact now, therefore, while the fostering of an increasingly cooperative relationship with Russia is clearly desirable, it is important for America to send a clear message about its global priorities, if a choice has to be made between a larger Euro-Atlantic system and a better relations with Russia, the former has to rank incomparably higher to America. So the US, according to his argument, would rather form stronger ties and stronger economic ties, I should say, to Western Europe, including moving into Eastern Europe, than form stronger ties with Russia. Because they're arguing that, well, I think I'll read it in a minute, but what they're arguing is that if Russia is brought into that Euro-Atlantic organization or that grouping, then Russia might pull the rest of Europe away from America, or Russia might intentionally cause a divide between Europe and America in their mind, but I don't think Russia had that intention. Russia did want to join the EU at one time and NATO, but America, it seems, was one of the main players who didn't want that to take place, because of their own worries that if Europe becomes closer to Russia, it could form a large Eurasian continent, which may end up pushing the United States out. Anyway, for that reason, any accommodation with Russia on the issue of NATO enlargement should not entail an outcome that has the effect of making Russia a de facto decision-making member of the alliance, thereby diluting NATO's special Euro-Atlantic character. So even becoming part of NATO for Russia is seen as something that will weaken the bond between America and the rest of Europe. And this is one, he has the idea of dividing up Russia. There's always been this concept or idea that maybe the West wants, or America in particular, wants to split Russia up into smaller countries. That's why they want to cause disruption in Russia and cause the people to turn against the president and bring down the government, basically. They're probably eyeing this concept of breaking Russia down into smaller states which the West can dominate, rather than of the current Russia. But here's an idea here. It's possibly one of the things they want to try and institute in Russia if things turn out a particular way with the war between Russia and Ukraine, or if Russia is weakened to the extent that they can pull off the program. Anyway, I'll continue. Given the enormous size and diversity of the country, a decentralized political system based on the free market would be more likely to unleash the creative potential of both the Russian people and the country's vast natural resources. In turn, such a more decentralized Russia would be less susceptible to imperial mobilization. This imperial mobilization is basically the leadership of Russia. Now, what they see Russia as is as a country as it is that wants to regain the territories that it lost after the ending of the Cold War and in more ancient Russian history, which is not the case. This is just something that America in particular likes to claim. A loosely confederated Russia composed of a European Russia, a Siberian Republic, and a Far Eastern Republic would also find it easier to cultivate closer economic relations with Europe, with the new states of Central Asia and with the Orient, which would thereby accelerate Russia's own development. So each of these three confederated entities would also be more able to tap local creative potential stifled for centuries by Russia's heavy bureaucratic hand. So basically they're arguing for the splitting up of Russia into three federated states, of which, as usual, America would come in and cause more division and maybe be looking to have those states split off completely from Russia and then access their resources. In terms of China, in Eurasia's Far East, China is likely to be increasingly central, and America will not have a political foothold on the Asian mainland unless an American-Chinese geostrategic consensus is successfully nurtured. And because China is in fact not likely to emerge as a global power, which it is a global power now, but this back in 1991, he didn't think that China would rise to be a strong economic power, which it has, today reached or recently reached, and it's still growing even though the growth has slowed down. But because for that reason it would be unwise to pursue a policy of China's regional containment. So he's saying that they didn't seek to contain China because they didn't think that it was actually going to grow the way that it has grown. It is desirable to treat China as a globally significant player, just to draw it into their sphere. Drawing China into a wider international cooperation and granting it the status it craves can have the effect of dulling the sharper edges of China's national ambitions. So they want to trump their ambitions or dullen their ambitions, basically, in terms of China becoming an expanding or economically strong country and state by bringing it into the global institutions like the World Trade Organizations and so forth. But that plan never worked. China ran its economy how it saw fit. It didn't fit itself into a box of the type of economic theories that are used in the West. Western economic theories tend to have a set formula, which China didn't follow. It picked elements from the West's economic formulas and used what it saw would benefit its own economy. An important step in that direction would include China in the annual summit of the world leading countries, the G7, especially since Russia has been invited too. So these are the early days when Russia joined the G7. Russia and China, I should say, joined the G7 before things took off the way they took off. Anyway, these are some of the theories and some of the perspectives of the books, The Grand Chessboard and The Tragedy of Great Powers by John Meishiam and Brzezinski. These are the two of the main. Meishiam is currently well seen a lot on YouTube, and he has written a number of other books similar to this one, but on different areas of international relations. But Brzezinski is also still seen and respected in US circles because of his ideas of dominating the world, of America dominating the world militarily, and basically how they see the world, their perceptions of how the world should be run and America's position in the world. So that's basic. I didn't touch much on Africa because both of the books didn't really mention Africa. So you can see that in their perceptions of the world, Africa, the Muslim world, I should say, or West Asia, is also not mentioned so much. They have this perception that certain regions of the world are not worth talking about. This is almost as if they're saying that these regions of the world will never really develop and remain poor, that they're not worth talking about as global players or even pivots. So that's a look into the mindset of the Western thinking when it comes to some of these topics, particularly in this current position in terms of what they call international relations. So that's the end of the show for today. The next topic will be covered in the coming new year. Yeah, that is it for now.